let's lay out the overview of generally what the issues are right now, right? So, generally speaking, we have the players, the viewers, and like Blizzard side internal, MDI production, casters, all that kind of stuff. Those are like the three groups, kind of. Or I guess there's a fourth group. You don't care. Doesn't pertain to you, blah, blah, blah. That's totally fine. The problem with the players is very simple, right? Players play the MDI for like a small number of reasons, but important reasons. Mainly like 2 or 3 reasons. One is money. 2 is the glory, or just like the, it's kind of like a broad category. The glory, the love of it, pushing yourself, trying to get better, blah, 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 blah. Those are like the 2 main things the players really play for, right? And the problem is both of those become taxing, and one of the major incentivizations, the money, just isn't there for players right now. So on a per week basis for the 3 cups, they get rewarded a total prize pool of $20,000 across the top 8 teams, right? That means, as you can see, this is literally taken from the actual MDI, like the rules and regulations area. So $8,000 for first place, right? If you get $8,000 for first place per player, assuming it's split evenly and somebody's not stealing all the money or something, the top team gets $1,600 per player over the course of a 2-week cycle. That includes time trials and then finally competing at the MDI. $1,600, not bad, right? Only if you're hitting first place. Obviously, nosedives after 4.5K, 3K, 1,500, 1K, 1K, 500, 500, right? So for, at the bottom of the barrel for 500, you're getting $100 per player, right? 500 divided by 5. Crazy, I know. But what does this really mean when you actually put it into perspective and where the complaints are coming from in terms of the hour investment for these players, right? Now, some of them have the ability, the capability, and the time free to be able to play night and day or many, many hours practicing. Teams like Echo and Perplex, for instance. Some don't because they have jobs or whatever. They just don't want to put that kind of effort into it. And that creates another problem that we'll talk about in a bit, which is disparity between the teams. But when you get to this point, let's take like the top teams, for example. They get time trials on Thursday and time trials close on Tuesday. Now, realistically speaking, yes, you don't actually spend 24 hours a day practicing. But let's say during those 5 days, it's not uncommon for teams to do somewhere in the range of 8 to 12 hours. Let's use 10 hours as an average, although maybe it's even more than that, right? So 10 hours, so that's already 50 hours. 50 hours spent during time trials, and then finally you get to MDI weekend, which is 3 days, and you're there playing and might do some games between and all that kind of stuff. Let's say on top of that there's another 30 hours, right? This could be like a bit of an overestimate or even a bit of an underestimate depending on which teams you're talking about, but let's go with like over the course of the 2 weeks about 80 hours, right? Average work week 40 hours for a lot of people, 80 hours. So that means if you achieve top spot and you get $1,600 for the 2 cups and you spend 80 hours doing it, you're getting $20 an hour, right? That's for the top team. The problem is there's really only like 2 or 3 top teams, and then there's a pretty big disparity in terms of experience and all that kind of stuff in the next teams. So if you're a new team trying to enter or compete and you're not somebody that can spend all this time and blah blah blah, you're probably looking more in the like $1,500 range, right? So you're looking at 1,500 divided by 5 players, so you're getting 300 divided by that 80.
Are you doing Dorgas?
$3.75. No, I need a bit. I'm gonna be AFK for like 20-30 minutes right now.
Oh, okay.
I'm just doing like running around and caching quests and stuff and talking to chat. So you're looking at like $3.75 per hour, right? That's not worth it. And so one part of the equation of why do players do this, the money aspect, is right in front of your face. If we go to like the big prize, right, the actual finals tournament, if you get first place at what would be BlizzCon or whatever LAN final, you're getting $30,000. Nice chunk of money for sure for all of that work. But the problem is only really one team gets that huge benefit. The drop off for second place is is $90,000. Like, you go down $90,000. So it's 60,000. So instead of 30,000 per player, they get $12,000 per player. Times, 12,000 in one chunk seems like a lot, but if you consider the amount of hours and practice ramps up even harder when we're getting to the finals, it's really like the amount of money per hour spent doing it is not worth it for many players. And don't take it from me, right? Case in point was that in Cup 1, we had like 3 teams that were, popular, well-known teams. They had some good players on them, experienced players. They just said, like, no, like, it's just not, like, fuck this, it's not worth it. And they left. There's people that, like Undad, like a lot of people that are like, this was fun a while ago, but it's just not worth it anymore. It's not worth it, not only in terms of the hourly investment needed for it, but the fact that most teams, like only Echo started doing it now, maybe it'll catch on, but most teams don't even stream their practice, right? So the time spent practicing and trying to get some of these minimal wins in is also double whammied spent not streaming if they're streamers, or YouTube creation, or whatever they might be that would be earning them income in the other somewhere else in another area, right? So that's one issue already, the money, right? Issue number 2 is the glory, right? The glory and the winning and stuff. The problem here is that, and again, we'll touch on this later, because a lot of this stuff isn't like, a lot of what we're going to talk about isn't like block problems, like this is problem 1, this is problem. There's a lot of problems that all kind of feed off each other and intermingle. So the whole like glory, etc. it's like, okay, if you're like BlizzCon stage kind of thing, etc. Again, super hard to get to. BlizzCon's not a thing anymore right now, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. And on top of it, the actual growth and exposure that you get from the program in the MDI is really not great, right? Like, it hasn't been very great. In fact, it's either been on par or kind of gone downhill in some areas. And players don't really get a lot out of it. So it's not really something that you use to boost your own stream a lot of the time, unless you're consistently winning. Sure, it's helped guys like Now and Mike, for sure, like Mike, Gingy, those guys. But that's like one team and how many, right? This tournament's not about one team. And for a tournament format to thrive and people to have fandom and for organizations to want to get involved, you need a lot of teams doing this kind of stuff and playing, not just one team or like 2 teams or something. So what's the issue with the money, right? The issue with the money is that if we take a step back, right, the MDI presents itself as an esport with the same common rules and expectations in terms of a time commitment as an esport. The thing is, in every other esport, these players are contracted by organizations and paid to do what they do. That's where a lot of the money and advertising and marketing and supplemental income comes in for those players. There's the Cloud9s and all those guys that go, here is a bunch of money, we want you to win, go. That doesn't exist in the MDI. Like, it barely exists, right? Like, we finally had Logitech for Echo Now. That's like one, back when I was like presenting and casting, there was like maybe 2 or 3 teams that were in that boat, right? Method being one of them, obviously Method is not Method anymore. But that kind of investment from orgs just doesn't exist for whatever reason, various reasons probably. The MDI is not a massively popular esport. There's not hundreds of thousands of concurrent viewers constantly looking at it. It's on YouTube now. We'll talk about that later, which hasn't helped at all. It's actually made it worse. And I'll get into the numbers with you guys in a bit. There's just no reason really for these orgs to invest in the program, right? And then the other half of the money comes from Blizzard side. But it's not the MDI program. Like, the MDI program gets a budget. Is the music too loud? I can turn it down a bit. The MDI program gets... There. The MDI program gets a budget from Blizzard, right? Blizzard goes, okay, we want to invest this much money in this project, blah, blah, blah. I talked about this yesterday. When we first started, like, I was there for, like, the pilot of the... Like, I cast the pilot of the MDI with Josh and Tespa and all that kind of stuff. And, they're given a budget, which I wasn't privy to, and they decide what to do with the budget. If a program is successful in a company, the company wants to invest more money into it in order to keep increasing its growth and its success so that everybody benefits and makes money and popularity and all that kind of stuff off of it. It feels to me like that hasn't happened with the MDI. Either funds have secretly been hoarded or something, or the budget really just hasn't increased drastically because the player prize pools had like a more sharp increase 3-4 seasons ago, something like that, and since then haven't really been changed. So a lot of the funding that would come, further funding that could come for players to entice them from like a monetary standpoint still doesn't exist. So you have both two major income sources that would entice players and keep them playing just non-existent in the MDI. So to backtrack again, we're not like, where do we stand now? We're in an esport presenting itself as an esport, having the same demand on players as an esport, but without any actual proper structural financial integrity of other esports. Like, it's like going to CSGO and LoL teams and whatever and saying like, okay, we still want you guys to practice as professionally and hard as you do for all of these games and still want to win them as badly, but we're not going to pay for it really anymore, by the way. Like, you just have to do it for fun. You know what I mean? A lot of people would say go fuck yourself because nobody wants to, like, work for free. So all these things, and we're going to touch about some of the finance stuff later. From the player perspective, it's starting to be really draining. And then there's other things with the player issue that gets frustrating too. You see guys like JB tweet all the time, etc., which is just like bugs in dungeons, right? Inconsistencies in balance. You know, the players wanting as little, understandably, as little RNG and variance and variation in dungeons and pulls and percentage and whatever, right? They want to pre-rehearse a dungeon a million times, get it down well like Perplex and Echo do, and then just, hey, like, this is our 1,001st time running this dungeon. We know exactly what's happening. Great, let's do it. No problem. The issue further that this creates, and is a point that Asmongold made, and it's a very good point, I don't have the tweet on hand right now, is that because of the massive time investment to little reward ratio that the MDI has, it becomes unattractive to a lot of mid to even high-end tier teams. Actually, all forms of teams, it becomes unattractive to compete. So you have a lot of teams starting to drop off, and then a lot of teams that want to enter, it's very daunting for them, right? Because they're like, okay, well, we have to compete against these teams that play 12 hours a day. They already have the experience. They got some like big names in there. We've never played together, you know, like, it's not something that teams want to do. So as this happens, the gap between the 2 to 3 teams that like have always been dominant and any other team that enters in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th place just starts to have a bigger and bigger disparity. So then you're ending up in a situation where it gets more boring to watch, because if it's like Echo versus YOLO team, Echo's just going to win every time pretty much, unless like, you know, a divine intervention happens or something. And also, you just get less participation of less good players and less good teams on average coming into the tournament, which also hurts the program because, well, you want to see skillful players doing their thing, and all the skillful players are saying, well, you know what, this isn't really not worth my time, so I'm not going to do it. So this kind of like uncapped 5 days of just go practice all you want just doesn't mesh well in reality with players that have jobs that can't let go of those jobs if they wanted to do this professionally, because there's no organizations backing them up. There's no Blizzard finance or you know, money like injection backing them up, right? So that is another big issue that this presents. So what these players want is max consistency so they can minimally practice their one comp, the meta comp, get away with it, and obviously perform that to its peak value. Let's move over now to section 2, the viewers. Here's the problem with the viewership. The problem with the viewers, not the viewership, but the viewers themselves, right? Myself being one now, because I'm not casting anymore, is that things have gotten stale. Right? Just like end of story. They've just gotten stale. It's not like a flame. You know, no one's trying to be rude or mean about it. The reality is the program has not developed much in 4 years. It's kind of become the same old, same old. And this is this is what's very important that people need to realize. This is not a PvP esport. This is a PvEVP esport. Nobody is directly facing each other. Two teams going head-to-head aren't really going head-to-head, right? It's an illusion created in a tournament format so that people can feel like there's a head, you know, one-on-one team and you can cheer your team on and all that kind of stuff. But it really doesn't fucking matter what the other teams are doing as far as your dungeon run. The only thing that matters is you can see on the other monitor that, like, oh, the other team wiped 15 times, okay, we can slack a bit, or we can do like a sketchy pull that we didn't try before. It's okay if we wipe, we'll still win. But their dungeon like barely changes your dungeon, right? Especially for two teams that are head to head. It's more akin to like a cooking competition, right? If you have a cooking competition, you usually have like 4, 5, 6 people cooking at once, and the judges judge it at the end, and the one that tastes the best like wins. Here it's like you just run your dungeons. There's nothing really stopping the teams from just all running at the same time. Like, hey, all 8 teams just go run at the same time right now. Fastest team wins. Same result happens anyway. Because of this, because of the fact that it's PvEVP and it's presented as a tournament, what happens is Blizzard needs to work extra hard to provide exciting elements to the program, because you don't have an infinitely variable amount of plays like you do in AWC and LoL and CSGO, where it's PvP directly. Every game is different. Every player plays differently every game. These are players that are going against a scripted dungeon that is consistent every single time, except for Mists. And it gets stale to watch because these players don't have to adapt to any randomized variance in anything. It's the same dungeon that they've done a million times, the same affixes. We practice this day and night. Let's just do it again. This time it just happens to be on a broadcast. It doesn't matter what the other team's doing. We just do it. We practiced every time, no problem. Because it's not a PvP, like I said, Blizzard then needs to make the program more exciting. How do they make the program more exciting? Tons of suggestions have come in from you guys, from all kinds of viewers, that are totally all correct and true, right? Hey, let's add like bans to certain classes. It gets boring to see the same 5 classes. Let's add map bans. Let's add like random affixes. Let's add, the A, B, C, D, like all these different things that add spice to what the players are doing in order to see different things happening, things that can get them off their games, things that can wipe them, things like that. But this is directly 110% contrary to what the players want. If you start to add random variables for the players that they can't practice ahead of time, that whatever, it means that they need, like, if they say, okay, from now on, we can ban Demon Hunters, we can ban up to 2 tank classes. That means all of a sudden the tanks are practicing Vengeance Demon Hunter all day long. Now need to practice Vengeance Demon Hunter and, I don't know, Prop Paladin and Guardian Druid, because if their first 2 picks get banned, they have to be ready with the 3rd pick. That means that the players need to invest triple the amount of time all of a sudden for those classes. It could be less, whatever, double the amount of time. They need to invest more time in order to practice against those variables in order to want to win. But what did we just talk about like 5-10 minutes ago? The players are already at their wits' end in terms of the little amount of return for their time investment. So they wouldn't want to do more. So this goes into like a self-feeding loop where the players don't want to do more, then more players are going to quit, and then the program loses more value because you have more valuable players and teams quitting. But then the viewers are getting more and more bored because it's the same thing over and over. It's just like the same dungeons that they do a million times. They even started streaming practices, so you already see what they're doing ahead of time. So it's caught in like a vicious loop right now where the viewers aren't wrong that they want this, and the players aren't wrong that they don't want that, because they want to, not have to go too crazy with practice. So this is where a lot of where I've been seeing a ton of complaint about the MDI and hey, the players, complaining about this and the viewers complaining about this, and no one's wrong. That's the thing. There's one side isn't wrong and one side's right. It's not, right? And a note about the meta, people are like, oh, it's so boring, watching the same 5 classes, and sure. And the way to change that up would be to do class bans and stuff. But we just talked about why that doesn't work. I mean, it does work for entertainment value. 1 second. My food's here. I think. It does work for entertainment value, but it doesn't work for the players, right? So the players are here to win. So even if something is 1% better in some way, which is the same 5 classes, sometimes 6, sometimes you see a hunter plop in there that you've been seeing, they will use it 100% of the time. And if there's no rule that says, hey, sometimes it might not be these 5 classes, we might decide to ban 1 or 2 of them, let's see what the other team does, which is a sorely needed element because they're trying to simulate a PvP environment. Having a team be able to ban another team's class would be super important, but that's not the reality we live in. They'll always use the meta. So as long as there's nothing stopping them from using these 5 classes, it's not their fault, right? Like, people are like, oh, it's so boring, play something else. Like, why would they, right? It doesn't make any sense. They're like, hey, we're here to like win scraps of money and shit. We're obviously going to play the meta. Puka, the food's coming up, by the way, I think. So these are kind of the general issues. Everybody's going to have more specific issues and you know, some personal stories and all kind of stuff. But from like a meta perspective, for lack of a better term, these are the issues between like viewers and players, or like viewership of the MDI and why people are finding it's getting stale, and the players that are, you know, unhappy with like the conditions and the hour requirement and all that kind of stuff, and what they want to get from competing is also lacking. So where do we go from here? The issue is that nobody talks about the Blizzard side of things, which is important to talk about. We've touched on a couple of things already, right? This is a PvEVP event, not a PvP event. And the fact that they need to consistently innovate to keep things fresh in this like faux PvP environment. The problem is they haven't been, right? In fact, they did a bit, but then things went backwards, right? Like back when I was there, we did try things like teams banning affixes, things like that. And it was actually interesting and it was more fun. Maybe led arguably to some better viewership, etc. But that's all stopped now. Like, that's all gone. Understandably, why? Because players also complained against that. So it's not like it went away because somebody was evil. Players didn't like that because of what I just mentioned earlier, right? Like, there's not enough incentive for players to want to have to practice their ass off extra for that increase in viewership. So Blizzard tilted the pendulum back in the favor of players in that sense, away from the favor of viewers, saying, okay, let's keep things more consistent, which is what you guys want, but it's really not as fun for viewership. And here we are again. Number 2, the move to YouTube was not good. And like, it was something that I battled with a lot in my brain before, like, deciding to like take a break from the program. And it's not my place to say, like, you know, it's not my place to like advise them on what to do. I think it was a bad decision. But I also don't think that it's their fault. I don't have proof of it, but I'm like, just very gut feeling what happened was that Twitch actually either lowballed them or did not want to renew World of Warcraft esports contracts, so then they took their business to YouTube. I personally think is what happened, because it wouldn't make any sense in my brain that at the time at least, growing MDI program and a at least solidified AWC program, if Twitch was like, yeah, here's like a nice, awesome contract, that Blizzard would be like, nah, let's just take a fucking random YOLO chance with YouTube instead, because that's going to work out great. So I don't think it was their fault, unfortunately, but YouTube did not help. And this is where we start to get into the stickler stuff, right? This is where you start to go, but Sloot, viewership on YouTube's actually been decent, right? Like, the first cup, we saw peaks of like 45, 50K. The second cup already dropped down to maximums of 25. I don't think I saw over 25. I didn't watch the whole time. Maybe like 30 sometimes, right? So it's already had a massive dip. Season 4 of BFA, the season that I left, viewership on YouTube was like, it was okay, right? Nothing great. We're talking like 15 to broad range, 25K range. Here's the major difference, though. The problem is, all of these numbers on paper might seem swell and be like, well, what's Sloot talking about here? The reality is, though, that what most people don't know is that all of these numbers, every single one of them, was with embedding bolstered numbers from being featured on the launcher. And I can tell you 100% that makes a massive difference, because back in my day of casting, which was everything up until the last season of BFA, there was some launcher support for sure. Like when the MDI hit 100K concurrent ever, which was during one of like the championships or the LANs, I forget which one, it was featured on the launcher. Back then, the launcher featuring, from what I remember, I can't say I literally every time watched it, but it was something that I really hammered about internally and was like, why aren't we using this? Can you ask to use this? Blah, blah, blah. So I watched it kind of like a hawk. And there was launcher support for like more major events back then, right? There's a LAN final or whatever, LAN weekend. Usually it's on the launcher. BlizzCon, obviously, on the launcher. Maybe once in a while, like a cup final. I don't know about a whole cup day, but like a cup final, sure. But for the majority of like the season and how it worked for the season at the time, there was, from what I remember, negligible launcher support. Once Season 4 BFA rolled around, there was a lot of change in MDI structure, right? Like a lot of things changed. It wasn't like just me that left and nothing else changed. Zorbrix had stepped down. He wasn't heading the program anymore. The producers and directors that we worked with the entire time in the Columbus, Ohio office, that office closed down. All those guys left and went to work with Adam at another esports org, then founded in Columbus as well. So the internal of the MDI vastly changed as well. It wasn't just like, oh, Sloot's not casting anymore. A lot of things changed. Zorbrix gone, producers gone, directors gone, venue gone. Everything changed, right? And I think the new folks have done like a fantastic job picking up like where it went before. So like absolutely no rag on that. I think they've done great. But a lot of things changed, right? And things became unfamiliar. So once that happened, that huge change internally, plus going from Twitch to YouTube, it's understandable that all of a sudden they probably internally really pushed for the launcher. And starting the season that I left, they got launcher support every single weekend for every single cast. And people don't know that. I don't even know if all the people internal know that. But that makes a very big deal. So the numbers that you see on YouTube and you go, oh, those actually aren't so bad because they were getting bolstered by embedded launcher. So the first weekend of the cup that you saw now, where some people are like, oh man, those are some of the best like just season cup numbers I've ever seen. They were embedded on a launcher, which was supposed to be like it. You don't get any better situation in terms of peak viewership reasoning as to why the launcher would boost your numbers so much. It's the beginning of an expansion. The meta has completely changed. Even completely unrelated to the MDI, traffic through the launcher itself, just because of the virtue of brand new shiny expansion, is through the roof. So you're getting a huge benefit from passive traffic through embedding on the launcher. Week 2, launcher was still embedded, viewership was down like 40%, 50%, right? Like these are just numbers. This is what I've been doing for like 8-9 years aside from MDI, right? This is the world I live in. Numbers, viewership, metrics, sponsors, etc. So this is something I know what I'm talking about here. So unfortunately, the move to YouTube was not good. I don't know, again, if it was in their power, in their wheelhouse, whatever, maybe. But the launcher is giving very bolstered numbers that, you know, it's not healthy to see those kind of numbers, because that's not like, it's good for the exposure. It might get some people being like, hey, what's this? Let me click on this. Oh, this is cool. I'm gonna watch for a bit, right? That's what you want to get, but it's misrepresentative of actual organic growth for the program. So if you were to take that shiny toy away and then see the numbers after that, then the picture would not be painted as nicely, right? So this all wraps up and goes back to metrics and everything at Blizzard HQ, and you know, people in finance and whoever's responsible for funding the MDI program looks at it, and then, you know, they say, well, the program's been doing well enough or not doing well enough, and here's your budget for the next year and all that kind of stuff. And it's seemingly after, you know, 4 plus years now of MDI that, you know, the program's not like at 150K concurrent. Neither is AWC, right? Actually, MDI often does better than AWC. I don't know about like right now during Shadowlands. I haven't checked all the AWC broadcasts. But when I was doing MDI, it was on average doing better than AWC most of the time. There was like a couple of casts where AWC did better. But either way, I don't know the ins and outs of the AWC, so I'm just going to stop commenting on it right there. I can just tell you what the numbers were, and then that's all. But for the MDI, right, it hasn't, you haven't had a steady, or not even a linear, but even a steady exponential growth, even with everything you can do to advertise it. Tweeting, retweeting, contests, embedding on the launcher, all that kind of stuff. All these tricks just aren't working well enough, right? Because you need to stimulate organic growth to the program, which means that viewers need to start enjoying watching it and telling others about it, and it's like the number one thing they want to do on the weekend. And it's hard for viewers to do that because of what did we just talk about? Because there's all these factors that don't make the program as fun to watch for a lot of people, which is why there's a lot of complaints about it. And why aren't these things then implemented? We just talked about that too. Well, all these things that could make it more fun for viewers, for viewer interaction. It's exciting to see teams fail sometimes. Like, that's fun, right? To see teams fail sometimes, to trade blows. Like, some of the highest numbers and most talked about matches in MDI history while I was there were things like the fucking bloodbath in Seat of the Triumvirate, right? Like, people like that kind of shit because it's so ridiculous. It gets stagnant. Like, as good as the teams like Echo, etc. do, it's a very impressive play and like usually flawless, etc. It gets a bit boring to see that every single time, right? Like, people want a bit of blood. People want a bit of variation to things rather than just the same thing every weekend. But again, we back it up even further. What did we just talk about that before? In order to implement those things, it means you need variance and you need viewer interaction or teams ban phasing each other or maps banning or shaking up the meta somehow or whatever, which means more player investment, time investment, which players don't want to do because of the finances that we talked about. So all of these issues just keep feeding off of each other. And I hate to be somebody that talks about problems and not solutions. I do think that there's some solutions out there, but unfortunately, like, hands on all three of these pillars, player, viewer, and Blizzard, like MDI team Blizzard, are tied a lot of the time, right? Because a lot of this is like, we need money, right? We need money to invest in this, and we need to give the players more money so that there's more glory and more reason for them to want to compete. How do we do that? We need organizations to be attracted to it. We need a bigger prize pool for players. Once that happens, players will be more inclined to run it, which means that Blizzard will have more free reign to start doing things for viewers that will increase viewership and make it more fun to watch, like ban phases, etc., that you see in a lot of other esports. That will then in turn increase their numbers. If they have higher, more consistent numbers and don't need to crutch on things like embedding in the launcher, etc., then it's easier to get a higher budget from Blizzard finances, whoever does that shit, and then start to get like a nice feedback loop going in there. But they just don't have that right now, right? There are some other factors that I did want to talk about as well that haven't helped. And another really big point to understand to the MDI, and is something that will always hold it back from ever becoming like a true esport, is that this isn't an esport that was like World of Warcraft was not a video game that was created for an esport. Like, end of story, right? The MDI is an adaptation of an MMORPG video game that people pay a monthly subscription for, and they tried to take an element of it and have done their best pretty successfully to turn it into like a viewer event / esport. It's not League of Legends where it's like built for that. It's not CSGO where it's built for that. It is its own complete biome, and some people wanted to try to make something happen out of it. And here we are with MDI. So as long as that exists and Blizz devs don't like specifically make balance changes and talent trees and rules and stuff for M+ in the MDI, it will never ever reach like a true peak esports program ever. That's not like a bad thing to say. It's just the reality, right? Because forever then we will be stuck in things like shadow meld metas, which are healthy but also unhealthy. Things like the MDI is presented the way like the developers want it to be presented. I mean, there's a reason why class restriction this season is there. Like, you can only play one class. Is because they tried to up like class representation, which they successfully did. Otherwise we'd maybe see like, I don't know, 2 unholy DKs or something. Who knows, right? It's just the MDI is used as a vessel oftentimes by WoW to showcase and to some extent advertise what like fun, healthy, whatever dungeons are like to World of Warcraft. Like, it is largely used also as kind of like a marketing tool, right? The weird thing is there's inconsistencies with that philosophy, because let me give an example. Which season was it? Actually, we didn't even talk about the season. We could just talk about the class representation thing, right? they want more classes to be represented at the MDI, so they put a class restriction so that more classes can be represented, and people go, oh, that's great. But then on the flip side, which is why I made my tweet like 2-3 weeks ago about Shadow Meld, then on the flip side, they allow Shadow Meld, which is super destructive for dungeon running and completely unrealistic of what like actually happens in game, and completely negates the seasonal affix prideful. So to me, even to now, even up to this point, it's actually shocking that they haven't nerfed Shadow Meld. But then we start to get in the discussion of like, well, do they need to nerf Shadow Meld just because of the MDI? Because most of the people don't really do that shit on live. So this is, once again, I've just further proved the point of where these arguments start to come in of like, well, why do this because the MDI guys do it when people don't do this on live, right? Like we always have to link the two together, which just like it dwarfs growth of it into an actual esport, because you always have to consider, well, but the real game, but MDI, but it's not actually the real game. So there's just all these cases that are just because the MDI doesn't exist in its own biome, in its own sphere in the WoW universe, you always have to consider it and link it back to live, right? So that is another major thing that is holding it back, right? If they do M+ talents, there have to be raid talents, right? And I've mentioned before that WoW wants to keep everything together as much as possible, right? They don't want like spin-offs of World of Warcraft. They don't want players that are playing this product and paying their monthly to go into the game and then go run M+, and then go run raid and be like, this feels like Toon is completely different all of a sudden. I don't understand what's going on. There's all these other talents. And then they go run PvP and they're like, this once again doesn't make sense. PvP is already kind of getting there. Like in some ways, obviously they have PvP talents and different behind the scenes numbers and tuning and aura buffs and debuffs that most people don't even know about. But for the most part, it's one of the reasons that they don't shard M+, and by extension MDI into its own thing. And it's not just about sharding M+ into its own thing, right? Like we're talking about an esport program adapted off of M+, because the reality is, which once again doesn't coincide with, we want to present this as like fun dungeons, is that the way the dungeons are advertised and built on the MDI and the way the viewership sees it in no way represents live, right? We don't have any control over our keys. We don't have any control to free swap covenants whenever we want. You usually don't see teams of 5 Alliance players running around with Night Elves only. And by the way, side note, another weird thing about the Night Elf Shadow Meld thing is, to me, is if they're trying to promote class diversity and then they don't nerf Shadow Meld, it means that most teams can only run Night Elves. So they're already class restricting themselves that way. But that's a different story for a different day. So already it doesn't like fully represent live. So once again, we're just caught in this like middle space of like, it's trying to be its own esport, but it's not, because its ties are still within World of Warcraft. And then the last note I wanted to do was about dungeons. There's been a lot of complaints from MDI players that dungeons are super shit and they were way better in Legion for MDI. And there's also been a lot of counter to that of people saying they actually really like Legion dungeons. They actually really like Legion dungeons, and for XYZ, usually based on live reasons. So like some of the complaints of like the dungeons in Shadowlands so far is that like they're linear. There's not, and as a result, there's not a lot of room for creativity in terms of like the different pulls. And what I agree with that is that, yes, generally if a dungeon's linear from a viewership perspective, it gets boring because it's just like a brute force race with the two teams, and there's not as much option for finesse and cool skips that you'd usually expect. Something like Sanguine Depths versus Eye of Ashara, completely night and day in terms of linear versus open door, and like, oh, one team's going left, one team's going right, and like, oh, it's so crazy, what's going to happen, and that crab is so bolstered and he's going to one-shot somebody. What I don't fully agree with, though, is I think there's two important factors here. I don't think Legion was like the pinnacle of open dungeons and openness. Like, I think people kind of remember that with rose-tinted glasses for reason number 2, which I'll get to in a second. But the reality is, man, the dungeons in Legion, like, there was as much variance with linear dungeons there as there was with open dungeons, right? Eye of Ashara, iconically super open dungeon, a lot of fun. Upper Karazhan, like, Not open, completely linear. Nelth's Lair had like a couple of, a few open areas, but for the most part, pretty linear. Vault of the Wardens had a few skips, but for the most part, it was pretty linear. You know what I mean? Like there was a lot of linearity in Legion dungeons as well. I think this is a bit subjective. People are going to feel differently, but I can't say that there's been a massive direction towards linearity in Shadowlands versus Legion, and Legion had 100% open dungeons, and Shadowlands had 100% linear Shadowlands had 100% linear dungeons, and Legion had 100% open dungeons. Because, it didn't. Maybe it was, slightly more in Legion and slightly less now, and to be fair, in Legion, we also had more dungeons. Let's see where the rest of the dungeons are in this expansion. But I don't personally believe there was a huge sway to it. What I do believe, and I think was good points that weren't actually even made by me, good point, weren't even made by me, but a lot of people made it, and I actually agree with, is that the MDI in Legion was new, and it was fresh, and it was, cool, and hey, this is new, let's fucking go. People have been asking for dungeon competitions for 10 plus years in World of Warcraft, but you take that concept, and 4 years later, when things haven't changed, which is what we talked about earlier, the program just hasn't grown enough, it's like the Eddie Murphy skit, right? If you're starving and somebody throws you a regular cracker, it's going to be the best damn cracker of your life. You're like, oh, goddamn, I got a Ritz cracker, right? But then when you wake up 4 years later and realize that it's actually the same old crackers, you turn over and you're like, oh, man, I just got some regular old crackers. And that's kind of what happened, right? The MDI, which is one of the things that I said earlier, needs to try and keep things fresh. And it has not kept things fresh for 4 years consistently. It's tried a few things that were great. They had to take some of those things away, like randomized affixes and stuff, because of issues with players and payment that I just mentioned earlier. And really, we're not that much further along 4 years later. So the MDI 4 years ago, super great. You kind of have the same old thing for 4 years. It starts to get a bit boring outside of the eye candy of new dungeons, which players are now complaining about. So I don't think the dungeons are specifically to blame. There might be some hits and misses there. It depends who you ask. Everybody's got their own opinion on that. But I think it's just the honeymoon phase of the MDI ended a long time ago, and people want some change behind it, right? Then there's just a couple of other things to mention real quick about just design, like system design. Lycio, that kind of feeds into the same things we talked about with restriction of what classes you bring, etc. It's not just the Shadow Meld thing. It's also game design decisions like AoE capping, right? I mean, you've seen fire mages and what they can do. Why would you not bring a fire mage? Why would you not bring the classes that are more capable of mass pulling a map, mass pulling large sections of Plaguefall, rather than a Ret Paladin or a Warrior, right? That can only hit 5 targets, and don't particularly excel at hitting those 5 targets anyways. So that kind of stuff has further, ironically, pigeonholed class choices and spec choices going into these competitions in what actually should be and is intended to be something that is meant to flourish and demonstrate class diversity, right? That's kind of all I really want to talk about. I don't want to turn this into a massive 4-hour presentation or something. I think there's a couple of other notes on here that maybe I'll bring up during the show, but these are the issues. Some of them are known to face, some of them aren't, and I've made them publicly known, like YouTube and launcher embedding and internal and stuff. It's not one big issue, and the point of this was to try also and educate people on why it's not why it's not easy to just point the finger and be like, oh, MDI sucks, why aren't they doing pick ban phase? There's a reason why a lot of these solutions and suggestions are a little more complex to actually do, and it's not their fault. I don't, I certainly feel for them. It's not easy, man, to see all these complaints. I was there, right, to see all these complaints from either viewers or players and try to do a balancing act where you have plates spinning on sticks and making sure nothing crashes to the ground. It's very tough, and a lot of the time people that have nothing to do with it start getting flack, the casters start getting flack, when it's absolutely not their decision at all. It's just a shitty situation. But if it stays like this, I don't want to say the MDI will die, right? But it will remain stagnant, and in the long run, that might just be as equal to dying as just killing it off, right? Because it worries me that at some point Activision Blizzard's just going to go, you know what? We haven't really seen any growth from this, so fuck it. It's going to go the way of Heroes of the Storm. Let's get rid of it, which would be a really big shame. Some of the it's a very complex web of issues that doesn't have one easy answer outside of inject a shit ton of money into it. That doesn't have an easy set of solutions, because by trying to do one thing, you're shifting and potentially upsetting the balance in some of the other areas. So yeah, that's it.